When you dare to share, you break the silence. When you dare to share, you speak your truth. When you dare to share, you use the full strength of your voice. When you dare to share, it brings opportunity to own your story. So tell it, be heard, and at the same time, your sharing is someone else's learning, inspiration, motivation, empowerment, and hope. There's always an element to each of our stories that remains a secret. For some, we feel it's a dirty little secret. Dare to share your untold story exposes these secrets in a welcoming and positive way. I encourage each of you out there to dare yourself to share what is yours to tell. When we dare, it is the courage to do something really important. Let this be a vow to each and every single one of us that we take risk, we brave, confront, and face what is, while inspiring and empowering all communities. So let's break that silence and tap into mental beauty. This is Salima Jadavji, your podcast host, a practicing clinical social worker, and your mental wellness connoisseur. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast, episode number 17, The Limitless Possibilities of Not Knowing Her Diagnosis. To all my fellow listeners, before we get started, I'm just dropping in a note to give you a heads up that this podcast might be emotionally triggering for you. We do invite guests onto the show who share openly about extremely difficult life moments with exposure and impact of what the struggles have been like. The intensity of each episode could have a variable impact on your emotional and mental well-being based on your own personal story. If at any point the topic becomes uncomfortable or upsetting to you in any way, please do not pressure yourself to listen. Instead, be kind to yourself, do some self-care, and perhaps give another episode a try. In this episode, I introduce our brave guest, Barbara Arrowsmith-Young. Barbara is the founder of the Arrowsmith program, which is an assessment process and a suite of cognitive exercises designed to stimulate and strengthen weak areas of cognitive functioning that underline a range of learning difficulties. Her program has been delivered for 40 plus years throughout the world. Her vision is that all students struggling with learning will have the opportunity to benefit from cognitive programs utilizing the principles of neuroplasticity, programs that change the brain's capacity to learn and open to these learners a world of possibilities. The genesis of the Arrowsmith program's cognitive exercises lies in Barbara's journey of discovery and innovation to overcome her own learning disabilities. She has written an international bestseller titled The Woman Who Changed Her Brain. She is also the recipient of the 2019 Leaders and Legends Innovation Award from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto for her contributions to education. Hi, Barbara. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast.
Hi, Salima. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, the pleasure is all mine. I have so much gratitude for you to be here today, and I'm also really thankful that you bring with you the willingness to share and for your support in taking a stance with me to help break down barriers of mental stigma.
My pleasure.
Just to give you a little rundown, like a little skinny for this podcast, it's all about bringing forward untold stories that people go through, whether it's directly related to a mental health issue or something else. And one thing that we know is that no matter what a person's story is, there is impact on one's own mental health in some way that often remains tucked away. So, through this platform, the intention is to break the barriers of mental stigma that have been conditioned in our society. So, I'm so hopeful that our presence together today really helps to encourage people to share and tell what often people have hesitation for disclosing. I'm bringing forward a new trend, and it's called the Mental Beauty Rethink. What are your thoughts about the Mental Beauty Rethink?
I love it. I think it's so important what you're doing. Really, there should be no stigma attached to having mental health challenges. It just should be just an accepted fact of our reality. And I mean, if somebody had diabetes, they wouldn't, feel shame. They would just seek out the support that they need to work with their condition. And it should just be exactly the same with mental health issues.
Right. It's so true. I often say it's this idea of such negative connotations attached to anything mental health related. You hear those two words, mental health, and there's this automatic negative connotation, but something physical health, it's like, oh, okay, let's go check it out.
Exactly. And it's very similar. My area of expertise is learning difficulties or learning
Mm-hmm.
disabilities. And it is very similar. There's incredible stigma, even still to today, around having a learning difficulty or learning disability. And it should just be part of the conversation. And if there's a challenge or a problem here, let's get a team and let's get support and let's find the best way to support that individual and to address the challenges.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay, Barbara, ready to dive in?
I am ready.
Okay, so let's start with my famous first question. Barbara, give us the newspaper headline of how you would title your untold story.
I would title it Triumph Over Adversity. I mean, that really, I think, has been my journey is,
Mm-hmm.
the adversity of having a learning difficulty and triumphing by finding a solution to address those challenges.
Yeah, a few words that says so much. Okay, so Barbara, let's get started with your untold story. Please share with us what your untold story is all about. Let us know the who's, the what's, the when's of your story, even the where's.
Absolutely. And some of it has been told, as you mentioned in my book, The Woman Who Changed Her Brain. And really, it's a story of being a young child, struggling with learning, being identified in grade one. And this was in the late 1950s. And I was identified as having a mental block because at that time there wasn't even the term learning disability. So really the teacher knew that I was struggling with learning, and I could certainly look around my classroom and I could see other
Mm-hmm.
students being able to do things and excel with activities that for me were either an incredible struggle and in some cases next to impossible. So my experience starting in grade one was one of anxiety, stress, avoidance. I learned very early in my schooling to put up my hand, go to the washroom, and hide out for 30 minutes
Right.
to, avoid kind of the shame of, not fitting in, not being able to do what other students could do. Or, I learned also very early to fake illness. I knew how to put the thermometer on the light bulb, to get just the perfect amount of temperature that my mother wouldn't take me to the hospital, but she would keep me at home. I remember on one of my report cards, my teacher saying, if I showed up to school more often, maybe I'd do better. I don't believe that was true, whether I was there or not. I
Right.
struggled.
Mm-hmm.
So, my experience starting in grade one was one of feeling ashamed because I couldn't do what other children were doing, not understanding, hearing my teacher tell my mother that she shouldn't have high expectations for her daughter, like not to really expect much of me because learning was always going to be a struggle. And I did struggle learning how to read, learning how to write. I mean, my mother was an educator, so she decided that I was going to learn to read and write, and she had flashcards. She created a whole kind of program for me. So eventually I did learn to read and write, but the learning difficulties were still there. So as often happens with child with a learning difficulty, is school became a stressor. Like school was not a place of joy or happiness. My first experience of negativity and being devalued came through my educational experience. And no matter how much my parents told me I was great, I was wonderful, they loved me, my experience every day walking into that classroom was very, very different. And that was where I spent, the majority of my day was in school. And I remember one of my students saying to me, everyone goes to school to learn things. I go to school to feel stupid. And that was absolutely my experience. And a few years ago, I did a presentation on, the impact of learning disabilities on mental health. And as I was reading that research, it was almost like a checklist, of my experience growing up. I could check off low self-esteem, social isolation, peer rejection, relationship difficulties, stress, anxiety, depression, shame, suicidal ideation. So there's a really intimate link, between having a learning difficulty and developing, mental health challenges. And so that was certainly my experience through schooling. And there was really no escape. I had to go to school. That was the expectation.
Right.
And it was incredibly stressful.
I bet. I mean, I can't imagine what that's like if you're feeling like I go to school to feel stupid. I'm having a hard time processing what that would be like for me. So I can't imagine what that was like for you and what sort of pain that was like for you on a day in, day out basis.
Yeah. Yeah. It felt like at times it was almost like a Herculean task, where, if I had to study for exams, because I had a good auditory memory and a good visual memory, but I didn't really understand things. Comprehension was a real challenge. So I would lie all my books out on my bed, and then I would kneel down and I would just cry from the depths of my soul. Like I would just sob uncontrollably. And I think later on, I realized I was probably putting myself in a Zen meditative state by removing all of the emotions from my system. And once I was totally drained, then I would study the first page of my notebook, and I would memorize it like a photographic memory. And then I would memorize the next page and I would join them up. And by the end of this long ritual, I would have memorized my whole book, but not understood it. But every time I sat down to do that task, it was the feeling of kind of hopelessness and despair, knowing how difficult it was going to be and not knowing if I'd be successful. Because when I went to write an exam, I didn't always understand what the questions were asking. I would try to guess at what they were asking. I would flip through, my mental notebook in my visual memory and try to find the words that I thought matched what that question was asking. And then I would write it down. And sometimes I made a really good match and I get 90%. And sometimes I'd make a terrible match and I get 10%. And then my teachers would assume that I hadn't worked hard for that 10%, that I'd slacked off. And I worked equally hard for the 10% as I did for that 90%. I just didn't make a good match. My learning difficulty got in the way. And that's very confusing. Like a lot of adults, make an assumption that if, somebody can do well here, then if they're doing poorly in another area, they must not be trying. And I remember one student I worked with, she thought her middle name was Can Do Better, right? Because that's all she heard, Devora can do better. And I was trying my heart out, right? And trying as hard as I could. But because of the learning difficulty, sometimes depending on the nature of the task, it would interfere. And sometimes it wouldn't because the task was calling on my strengths. And it does create a very confusing picture, not only for the adults in the situation, but also for the child, because we want to master things. Like children and humans want to be successful. We want to master things. And I learned that effort didn't always lead to success. Like sometimes I could do something, for 5 minutes or 2 hours, and I would get the same result.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask, when you talk about the learning difficulty, I know that before you mentioned there was some strengths that you had, right, with the auditory and visual gifts that you had. And I know that you've been describing how sometimes your efforts would be a good match for the results, and sometimes it wouldn't be. And sometimes you'd spend so much time doing something and maybe not so much another time, and there was no way of gauging what it was going to be like. How did you perceive it to be like? What was it like when you couldn't comprehend? What were the actual struggles that you were noticing in terms of the differences in how you were reading or writing? What did you notice come up in your learning style?
Yeah, well, I definitely could read the words, right? Like I learned with my mother's help how to actually decode, as they call it. Like, so I could read the words and I actually became a pretty fluent reader. But I didn't understand what they meant. Like I might have to read a sentence over multiple times to grasp the meaning. So it was almost, if you can imagine that you're reading a book in Italian and you don't speak Italian, but you can pronounce the words because, phonetically you can sound them out and it uses the same alphabet that we use, but you don't know what those words mean. And that was my
Right.
experience. It was like language was foreign.
Reading a foreign language, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so, did you feel like you were reading the words backwards at one point, or were you reading them out of order at some point?
Early in my schooling, I definitely read things backwards and I wrote backwards. And when I did
Mm-hmm.
mathematics, if it was 12 plus 14, I'd add the 4 and the 1 and the 2 and the 1 because it was just
It
like
all seems
everything was sort of
separate.
random, right?
Right.
It
Yeah.
was very, very confusing. And eventually, though, I learned, with practice to write the right way and to read the right
Mm-hmm.
way. I can still read upside down now and backwards. I mean, it was one of the benefits of that
Oh, that's
difficulty.
a benefit.
Yeah, a little
Right.
side benefit. But
Mm-hmm.
once I got the mechanics down, it was the meaning. It was,
Yes.
it was the meaning. I couldn't connect ideas. I mean, if it was something like, the sky is blue, that I could understand because I could conjure up a visual picture of a blue
Yeah.
sky, like there's an
Right.
image. But if it was my mother's sister is my aunt, like that's a series of
Mm-hmm.
relationships, and I couldn't figure out like how could she be my mother's sister and also be my aunt? Like I couldn't
Right.
connect
Okay.
things. Like I was
Got
very
it.
concrete. Things
Mm-hmm.
like fractions, I could understand one because I could put down one object. I could understand four because I could line up four objects. But as soon as you put the one over the four, a fraction, it became a relationship of a part to a whole. It meant
Right.
nothing to me. My father was a mathematician and a physicist, and he
Mm-hmm.
tried to teach me math from logic, and there was no logic in my world. And so I would, wait till he went away on a business trip, and then I would go down in the basement. I'd actually bang my head on the dryer. Like, I don't know if I thought I was banging some sense into my head. And I would actually pull out my hair. And then I would just memorize everything. And again, sometimes I would do well on an exam because my memory carried me. And my father then thought he taught me well. Well, I couldn't learn the way he taught me because he was using reasoning, like, and even things as simple as, when somebody is conning you, right? Somebody is having you on. Like one of the ways you know that is you hear logical inconsistencies in what they're saying, like something doesn't
Right.
quite fit. Well, for me, there
Right.
was no logic in my world, so there were no logical inconsistencies. So I was vulnerable to con artists. It was really, really challenging. Somebody could kind of sell me the Brooklyn Bridge because I couldn't figure out that
Right.
logically didn't make sense. So it didn't just affect me academically, but affected me in relationships. I didn't understand why people did things. I didn't
Right.
understand people's behavior. Is someone being nice to me or not nice to me? Like the whole world of social relations was challenging and confusing. And I felt incredibly isolated. And I remember, having this image that my face was pressed up against a plate glass window. And on the other side of that window, there was a banquet. There were people laughing and having wonderful meal and interacting. And so much I wanted to be part of that. But the plate glass window was like my learning difficulty, preventing me from being able to relate and engage because I didn't understand. I used to be terrified, if somebody would come and ask me a question because I thought, first, I might not understand what they're asking
Right.
and then give them the wrong answer. And so I learned early to smile a lot, like, like really smile and try to be friendly and hope that
Mm-hmm.
people wouldn't look too deeply. And there's this
Right.
concept in mental health of, the imposter phenomena, this idea that somebody sees themselves as a fraud with a belief that, if they are successful, it's due to luck and it's not really due to their abilities. Well, I had a huge imposter phenomena. I used to think, if anybody really looked deeply, they'd see that it was kind of a house of cards built on a really shaky foundation. And I lived in fear of being exposed as a fraud because I felt, I just didn't understand my world. And I felt like an imposter in my life, which is not a good feeling to have.
You mentioned that when you have been struggling with the academics, that, it affects you in so many other parts of your life. It wasn't just in the mechanics of how to string words together, and it was beyond meaning of understanding the comprehension of language. You said that it affected you in your relationships and how you viewed the world, right? So I'm curious if you hid that confusion. How did you hide that confusion and lack of understanding? I know that you mentioned that you started to smile and master the art of smiling and nodding. Was there anything else that you also found yourself doing?
Well, I would avoid a lot of social interactions. If there was just one person that I was interacting with, it wasn't as challenging because, it was just one piece of, interaction or information that was coming at me that I had to interpret. But if there were
Right.
multiple people, I'd have to try to understand, okay, what did that person say? And it wasn't memory, it was understanding. And then how did that relate to what the other person said? Like there was a mosaic, right, of all the information and attaching meaning to it. So I would really avoid social interactions where there were multiple people and just try to relate to one person. And I really didn't have friends. Growing up, I might
Mm-hmm.
have one friend that was all I could handle. Like, because it's again being able to kind of see relationships. And it's critical. Like if you think about, cause and effect, it's seeing if this happens, that happens, right? You have to connect two things. I could not connect two things in my life. I didn't understand why people did things. And I used to describe feeling like I was a puppet and somewhere there was a puppet master pulling the strings, but it was random. I felt like I had
Okay.
no control over my life. It was like that kind of buzzing, booming confusion because I didn't understand, right? So I avoided social interactions and social
Right.
situations. Even though I longed to be part of them, I knew that I couldn't effectively, right? I just couldn't contribute.
Mm-hmm. So, Barbara, could you trust your strengths and exceptionalities in the midst of all the confusion? Because I know that you are aware, and perhaps you were aware of all of the different things that you were really good at. So, could you trust yourself with the things that you were good at?
Really interesting question. I mean, I knew that I had a good memory, both auditory, like I could listen to something and almost like a recorder, I could record it and then play it back from listening. And visually, I had a photographic visual memory, so I could
Mm-hmm.
visualize. But to me, I knew that, yes, those are strengths, but they aren't the critical strengths in terms of being able to understand one's world, right? Like, so yes, I could use them to get by, I could use them to compensate, but to me, it didn't make up for the significant area of difficulty because having a visual photographic memory didn't help being able to relate to people or to understand concepts like, in science or mathematics. So again, those strengths kind of got devalued because they were limited, right? And it's a thing like anything where you're compensating. Like if you're compensating for something, that compensation never does, sufficiently compensate for what you're trying to work around. Like you're working around something, and with the things you're working around, they can't really do the job of what you're working around, if that makes any sense. And so,
Yeah, it does.
you're putting in so much more effort and it's working to a minimal degree. It felt like, sort of I was treading water all the time, like just treading water and keeping my head above water, but with incredible effort. And, one of the other things I talked about growing up is I lived in a fog. Like I just felt like there was this fog around me all the time that interfered with my perception and understanding of my world. And
Right.
everything was unclear. And that, I used to keep a journal and I would describe, this fog where meaning would just kind of disappear and it was floating like smoke. So, I was more aware of the challenges of the difficulties than the strengths because they were really inadequate in
Mm-hmm.
terms of allowing me to do the things I really wanted to do in life. And at a cost because, it meant by the time I got to university, I was studying 20 hours a day and sleeping 4 hours a night and eventually compromised my immune system and developed an immune system disorder. And the research now shows that people with learning difficulties are more likely to have physical illnesses or physical ailments, because all of that stress, like it affects your endocrine system, your immune system. And so not only are these individuals struggling with learning and, having issues with anxiety and depression like I did, also it can affect your health. So it has really, really significant impact.
Right, absolutely. And so, Barbara, when people come to see me for therapy, individuals are typically in one of three places. Some are getting started, some are in the middle, some are looking back with a particular chapter in their life. And so I'm curious as to what part of the journey that you're in, specific to the journey of uncovering the root of your learning difficulties. Would you say that you're in the middle, getting started? Are you looking back? Where are you?
I'd say so. I've never been asked that question. I mean, for myself, there's still things that I uncover. Like, I don't have the learning disability anymore. Like, that's the work I created, was to take the concept of neuroplasticity, stimulate the brain in specific ways to overcome the learning difficulty. So I don't have the difficulties I had. In fact, I have strengths in those areas. So there, maybe I'm looking back. But in terms of the emotional impact, it still at times comes up. And I mean, I'd say, I'm a significant way along. But every once in a while, something will get triggered, and I think about it, and I think, oh my gosh, that's the emotional effect of that learning difficulty. Like for me, with my difficulty, I lived in a world that was uncertain. Like, the brilliant Russian neuropsychologist Luria, who helped me through his writings understand my problem, talks about if somebody has the difficulty in the brain that I had, they can never verify meaning. They walk around in this constant state of uncertainty. And that was my life. Like, I felt like walking on quicksand where the ground would shift under my feet all the time. And so now, and we're living in a world of uncertainty, when something is really uncertain and I don't have to see a solution, but if I can't even see a place to start to work towards a solution, my anxiety skyrockets. And that's, remnant of the emotional impact of having the learning difficulty. Now, though, because I don't have the learning difficulty, I can say, hey, that's what's getting triggered there. And, I can do deep breathing, I can meditate, I can calm my nervous system down. And because of my difficulties, I used to be like on high alert. I said I had a jangly nervous system. Like, this tiniest little sound, I would jump. Like I was hyper vigilant. And that took a number of years, again, through meditation. And I absolutely, after I worked on my learning difficulties, I did go into therapy because I recognized that, yes, now cognitively, I'm in really good shape. But, for 26 years, I've lived with this, and all those emotional patterns and triggers are built into the system. And I needed support to work with a therapist to address those. So there'll probably always be remnants that will pop up, but I now have tools and techniques and understanding to deal with it. And when I had the learning disability, I would not have been able to benefit from therapy. In fact, I tried therapy, and because I couldn't understand meaning, I couldn't develop insight. Like if you can't connect two things, you can't have insight, right? So, and interestingly, there have been clients that I've worked with the same difficulty I had, and they're in therapy, and their therapist notes that when they hit a certain point in the cognitive program, they can benefit from insight therapy because now they can see relationships, just like I can now, but I couldn't have before. And to me, it's the power of the brain is that it filters our perceptions and our understandings of ourselves, of other people, our world, our relationship to that world. And if there's something off in that functioning, it will have a significant impact well beyond school in relationships. And that's really important, to recognize, because a lot of people think that a learning difficulty or learning disability is just a school problem. And, one parent said very wisely, school is just a metaphor for life. Like these problems will carry through in life and they will have emotional impact. And one of the chapters in my book, chapter 22, is called The Impact of Learning Disabilities. And it talks about all sorts of students in their own voices talking about, the mental health impact, the emotional trauma that was part and parcel of living with the learning difficulties. So, and there's research showing that individuals with learning difficulties are more than twice as likely to experience depression, anxiety disorders, suicidal ideation. It's very, very significant, and I think a lot of times not understood.
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious, knowing that you've shared where you feel you are on this journey, both the cognitive aspect as well as just the emotional effects and unpacking, what do you want to remember about the process of your healing journey?
I think there was a lot of at different points. I mean, determination. I mean, I was determined to,
Mm-hmm.
see whether I could overcome these problems, the learning difficulties that I had. And there certainly at the time was no science to say it was possible. I mean, there was science with animals, to say there was neuroplasticity, but there was not even a belief in humans that there was human neuroplasticity because this was 1977, 1978.
Right.
And there wasn't a belief that learning difficulties had something to do with the brain. So, the people my professors that I talked to at the time said, well, learning disabilities have nothing to do with the brain, and even if they did, the brain is fixed. So what's the point? But then I remembered, my father was a very wise man, and he said, if there's a problem in the world and no solution, he said, it's your responsibility to try to find a solution. And then he said, if the rest of the world tells you you can't do it, he said, don't be limited by conventional wisdom. This is how science goes forward. So I had that drive and that kind of message from my father. And so there was some excitement in the process. Like I felt like I was forging new territory and new ground to see, was there human neuroplasticity and was this possible by putting two lines of research together, Luria's work, identification of function of different parts of the brain, and then Rosenzweig's work. He was a psychologist at Berkeley, looking at stimulation and neuroplasticity in animals. And I figured if animals have neuroplasticity, humans must surely. And I proved the point, like as going through the programs that I created for myself. And I had multiple learning difficulties. So I couldn't create just one program. I had to create a series of different programs for my different cognitive difficulties. So it was kind of a time of excitement, of discovery. And then as I started to see the changes, it was like exhilarating. Like it felt like all of a sudden my world from a tiny little constricted reality just expanded, and I could listen to things and understand them in real time. I lived in what I called lag time before,
Right.
where I'd be hours behind everybody else in understanding things, and sometimes I never did. Now I could listen, understand, I could actually make a comment. I was part of human discourse for the first time in my life, and it was so powerful, like that I could be part of the world and engage in the world. And then when I saw these changes, I thought, I need to take this work out into the world to help other people that are also struggling with learning difficulties. And some had similar problems to me, and some had very different problems.
Yeah.
And it became this kind of amazing naturalistic experiment of working with people, really deeply trying to understand, what was going on, and then creating a series of exercises to address their problems. And this is how this work grew out of first my journey, and then the journey of many other people.
Yeah, it's the birth of the work that you do now. And I was just thinking, when you were telling me about the determination and the discovery and the excitement, I could just feel that exhilaration in terms of what you must have felt once you started to witness those changes, and that changes and the learning was happening and the adjustments were happening, the confirmation that, oh my gosh, there's change here, like there's something happening here. So I was just getting so excited as if you were telling me. I was visualizing myself as a child, and then I was visualizing myself like in university years as you were talking. And I was thinking, like, wow, like that would have been so encouraging that there's like this new sense of hope, like a renewed sense of hope.
It really was. And I mean, being a little, I don't know, skeptical. Like, first I thought, is it a
Yeah.
fluke, right? Because, that
Hmm.
whole imposter phenomenon, like,
Yes. But then also your father, what he said to you, about like when you come across a problem and you can't find a solution, it's your responsibility to go out and find one. And you just took that under your wings right away.
I did. And I tested myself, like, like
Yeah.
as the changes were happening, I gave myself little tests, right? Like, at one point I had access to a philosophy library, and philosophy is very conceptually dense. So I'd never understood philosophy. So I thought, okay, I'm going to test myself. So I pulled one book off the shelf and I opened it at a random page and I read it and I thought, oh my gosh, I understand this. But I thought, okay, maybe I picked a
Mm,
really easy book. So then I pulled
right.
another book off. And by the time I was finished, I had 100 books piled up all around me, and I'd been
Right. Wow,
able
that
to
was your evidence.
understand everything I had read, and that
Right.
was I was walking on air.
Yep, that was your evidence right there. Like, oh my goodness, this is not imposter. This is happening.
Yes.
Hmm. That is so fascinating. Barbara, I want to ask you, just going back into the mental health aspect and how your untold story affected your mental health. Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned how when your father would go away for work, you would go down to the basement, and you described how you worked through the pain, and you talked about banging your head on the dryer and that whole process. Did anyone ever learn about it? Did anyone ever know that was something that was happening to you?
No, no. I mean, and so I hid it because there was, I was ashamed. Like, to me, I should
Hmm.
just be able to learn. Like, my brothers could learn mathematics the way my father taught, and I couldn't,
Hmm.
right? So
Right. So you're punishing yourself.
yeah, yeah. So that's one of the things about learning difficulties. There's so much stigma and shame associated. So children keep it silent. And when I was writing my book a few years ago, I interviewed hundreds of people, and what I heard from all of the students was they said we made a pact of silence, that we were not going to let our parents know how bad it is. And certainly the research supports that, because if you ask a child with a learning difficulty to really open up and describe their pain, and then you ask their parent to describe what they see, is a very different story. The parent does not see the degree of suffering that the child is experiencing. And that certainly was my experience, and what the research shows, and what all of these students said, because they don't want to burden their parent. They feel ashamed. But the challenge is, as we know, if we don't talk about these things openly, they kind of fester and become, even more of a problem, because then you don't have the, adult resources to support you through the difficulty. So it becomes kind of this catch 22. And certainly in my case, my parents didn't know how much I was suffering. I mean, they didn't know, at age 13, I attempted suicide, um, and they had no idea that I was in that much pain.
How did they not know? I mean, like, were you at home when this happened, or
Yeah, yeah, I was at home, but again, this was many many years ago. We didn't have the internet, so there weren't
Mhm.
instructions as to how one went about doing it. And I just thought, um, that you make nicks in your wrist. And then I went to bed, and I thought, I just wouldn't wake up in the morning.
Right.
So, there weren't manuals on how one goes about doing these things, or as much exposure. So when I woke up the next morning, I thought in my mind, oh my gosh, you can't even get that right. Like, it was another example of
Mhm.
failure. I mean, today I'm very glad that I wasn't
Right.
successful, but at the time it was again just another example that, that I was worthless and useless
Mhm.
and a failure,
Right.
because I couldn't even get that right. But again, I mean, I kept everything under the surface. Like, my parents didn't know that I sobbed for an hour before I did my work. And because I worked so hard, I got passing grades mostly. So there wasn't the evidence that I was struggling, and I was struggling.
Was there a point ever? Like, at some point, did they know?
When I started developing the work, yes, I had conversations
Okay.
with both of my parents, and they were devastated, right? They
Right.
were heartbroken that they didn't know the degree of pain and suffering that I had gone through, and it was
Mhm.
really very cathartic, to have that conversation, because I absolutely, there was no
Yeah.
blame on my part. Like, how could they know? Because there wasn't even the concept at that time of these
Right.
kinds of struggles. There wasn't awareness. They weren't talked about, and I kept it hidden. So,
Right.
but it was, yeah, it was very, very, I think, freeing for all of us to really talk very, very openly. And that's why I'm so passionate about my work, because I travel around the world and meet students around the world with learning difficulties and hear, similar stories. And no child should feel so much despair that they feel that ending their life is the solution to that despair. So I'm passionately committed to helping students overcome their learning difficulties. And I realize this is one piece of the puzzle in supporting
Yes.
students. This isn't the only piece. And for those students with learning difficulties, it's a significant piece.
Absolutely. I mean, there's such a strong link between learning difficulties and mental health, and you've just nailed discussing all of the different aspects of it. So, Barbara, what is your key message to the listeners of our show?
I think it's a message of hope and optimism that if one has a difficulty, there are solutions. Some of the solutions, are tried and true. Some of the solutions might be relatively new, and some of the solutions might be yet to be developed. And my area is neuroscience and neuroplasticity. And we're seeing with this concept of neuroplasticity, our brain is capable of change across our lifespan, that a lot of things that we thought were fixed and unchangeable actually aren't. So these principles are being applied to people with chronic intractable pain. They're being applied to people with obsessive compulsive disorder, people with post-traumatic stress disorder. In my area, people with learning difficulties. I think there's just so much that we're learning that can say there is hope and never give up. Like keep hunting and looking to find the solution or set of solutions that are going to work for you as an individual. I think, I've had a number of health issues and I take that same approach that I did to the learning difficulties, like just keep investigating and asking questions and being curious until you find what is going to work for you.
Those are really great words of wisdom. Especially, I like how you summed it up at the end, just now when you said, keep investigating, ask questions, get curious, and really formulating something that's unique to you. It doesn't have to be that it works for someone else, so it's going to work for you as well, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, we're all tailor made. So,
We are like, and
yes.
there's a movement to individualized medicine,
Hmm.
individualized therapeutic approaches. My work is very
Exactly.
individualized treatment or
Right.
addressing learning difficulties. There is no one size fits all. Like say to parents, if somebody says that there's one thing that's going to address all your problems, run in the other direction, because
Right.
it would be lovely if it was that simple, but we are complex beings, incredibly
Yeah.
complex beings. So there's complexity to the solutions to the difficulties.
Absolutely. So, Barbara, I'm curious about what your game changer inspiration is that's close to you that reflects your untold story. Is there an inspirational quote or book or something that speaks to you? I think you were referencing a book earlier.
Well, there's a book that started me on my journey that changed
Mm-hmm.
my life and actually
Mm-hmm.
saved my life. I don't believe I would be here if somebody hadn't handed this book to me in August of 1977. And it was called The
Okay.
Man with the Shattered World. And it was written by this brilliant Russian neuropsychologist, Alexander Luria. And this was the
Yes.
first time that I saw my problem on the pages of a book. Because it described the story of a Russian soldier who had a very localized head wound, so he had damage to his brain, and Luria was
Right.
describing what that meant. And then this individual was keeping a journal describing his experience. And as I read this man's journal, I thought I could be writing the same journal. And in fact, I was. We were using the exact same language. I mean, he was in the 1940s in Russia, and I was the 1960s in Canada, but we were using exactly the same language. And that was my aha moment. My problem is something not working in my brain. So that, I believe books can save lives and be inspirational. So I have I have a life debt of gratitude to Luria for that book. And then obviously I read many more of his books to try to understand more about not just my difficulties, but the difficulties of other people I worked with. And he was brilliant. So, I feel like I stood on his shoulders, like that concept of standing on the shoulders of giants to move science forward. Without his work, I could never have understood what my problem was and then worked to find a solution. So, that's probably, the book that had the most significant impact. It was a turning point in my life, right? That basically led me to do the work that I do now.
Yeah. And when you talk about this book, it really seems like when you told me about that aha moment, when you said that out loud just now, it's like that connection of there's a reason for my struggle and gave you that validation that it was real the whole time.
Very much so. That because I thought maybe I'm crazy, right? Because I was going to my professors who, they were teaching school psychology, which is like how you assess learning difficulties. And I said,
Mm-hmm.
I think I have a learning difficulty. And they said, first, you couldn't be at university and have a learning difficulty, which we know is not true. But at that time,
Right.
that was a belief.
Right.
And so I knew there was something really wrong, but everybody around me wasn't willing to have that conversation because,
Mm-hmm.
again, they saw that I was functioning. And this
Right.
was the first, like, I'm not crazy. I mean, maybe I was,
Right.
but not around this. I was not crazy. There actually was a reason for my challenges. And,
Yes.
then back to my father, creating a solution. You can't really create a solution for a problem unless you know the nature of the problem. So this was the first
Mm-hmm.
piece, right? I had to understand what was the source of the problem before I could develop something to address it. And so it was pivotal in healing myself and then taking this work out into the world to help students around the world. And the work is in 90 educational organizations in 10
Mm-hmm.
countries. And my passion and vision is just to make this a normal part of education. We go to school to learn, we learn with our brain. Let's put the brain into the equation of education and work the brain while the students are learning academic curriculum. And we have schools now that are implementing that model, which is really exciting.
Right. So, Barbara, you've shared so much about your journey, which was so enlightening for me. And you talking about overcoming severe learning difficulties through the science of neuroplasticity and then taking it out into the world and transforming people and lives globally. It's just exceptional. It really is. And so, my assumption is that there's going to be even more people that want to connect with you. So, what's the best way for people to find you?
So the best way is probably through the website. So there's the website arrowsmithschool.org or arrowsmithprogram.ca. They both take you to the same place. And there's a wealth of information there. There's descriptions of the different kinds of learning difficulties that we can
Mm-hmm.
address. There's the research. We're actually doing research now at universities, looking into the brains of students as they're going through this work and seeing the changes in the brain, as well as changes in social emotional well-being, changes, reduction, in stress, changes in
Mm-hmm.
academic performance.
Right.
So that website has a wealth of information. I'm on LinkedIn under Barbara Arrowsmith Young.
Okay. And if anyone wanted to connect with you directly, would you be open to that?
Probably the best way is to go through the website. Like, I'm not usually the person now, like, I'm doing a lot of writing and a lot of research.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not really terribly accessible through that.
Okay. But they can go to the contact section.
Yeah, yes, the
Okay.
contact section. So we welcome people. And there's also a questionnaire now that's on the
Mm-hmm.
website
Okay.
that's free that people can answer. So you can kind of get a snapshot of your
That's neat.
cognitive profile by doing that questionnaire.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing those. So, Barbara, you just dared yourself to share. Congratulations.
My pleasure. And thank you for hosting this podcast because I think it's really, really important.
Thank you. And again, Barbara, I just want to acknowledge and also thank you again for showing up with vulnerability, with willingness to do this. Such an eye opening reveal. And it also gives me such a sense of gratitude to be part of all of these stories here, like yours. Just all the vulnerability and courage and inspiration. So, thank you so much for sharing so openly. And of course, once again, thank you for being part of Dare to Share Your Untold Story and helping to be a voice in breaking down the barriers of mental stigma.
My pleasure. Thank you.
To all of our listeners, If you like what you've been hearing on this podcast and you want to be part of breaking down barriers of mental stigma, I invite you to go wherever you are listening to the episode and hit subscribe. Leave us a comment or a review of the episode and maybe how you relate to it. To learn more about what we offer, visit www.daretoheal.co. And if you are feeling ready and brave to share, please submit your story by visiting www.daretoshare.co. Thanks for joining in.